Great, we'll get started. Alistair, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good morning, everybody. My name is Alistair Main, and I am Head of Assurance Services at Duncan and Toplis. I hope everybody is well, and thank you for joining us this morning. On behalf of both Freeths and Duncan and Toplis, welcome to the first in our series of joint webinars in partnership on the food sector. And today's webinar or panel session is looking at the challenges for the here and now workforce in the food sector. We're privileged to have on our panel of experts here today from Freeths. We have Emma Brooksbank, who's Business Immigration Partner. We have Daniel McNally, who's a Regulatory Managing Associate. And then from Duncan and Toplis, we have Heidi Thompson, who is our Human Resources Director and Head of Payroll and Human Resources Services. Before I pass you over for their short presentations on their particular areas, we do want to encourage you all to ask questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see on the sort of toolbar, there's the Q&A box in there. So as and when you think of questions during the presentations, please submit them there. And then after the presentations, we're going to have a time where I will put the questions to our panelists and we will see what we can answer. We have a certain set amount of time. Anything we don't get around to answering, we will answer in a follow-up in the coming few days. So please fire away, submit your question. Now is your chance to get our panel of experts to answer everything that you want to know. So without further ado, I will pass over to Emma, who's going to kick us off talking about the challenges for the here and now workforce in the food sector. Emma, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Alistair. Welcome everyone. So I will be kicking off with this sort of broad discussion around workforce needs, workforce demands in the food and agriculture sector. Now, as an immigration specialist, I'm acutely aware of the fact that we will be fully leaving the European Union on the 31st of December 2020, which will result in the end of free movement. Now, we do have the 2021 immigration system coming in. We heard a little bit more about that from Priti Patel yesterday, but I'm yet to be convinced that that new system is sufficient or adequate to provide a workforce in the nature and structure that is needed for this sector, for the food and agriculture sector. My first concern really is whether the system provides sufficiency in terms of numbers. Now, this sector actually has one of the only sector-based schemes in the UK. So it has the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, that's SAWS, which provides for 10,000 6 months, so short-term, non-extendable visas to essentially provide for harvest time during, so provide for harvest time for the edible horticulture sector. But, you know, the NFU, the National Farmers Union, estimates there's actually 80,000 roles during peak season. So there's a real question and a real concern about whether 10,000 visas, even if that was doubled in the start of 2021, whether that's really going to provide a sufficient workforce for the sector's demand. Now, the ONS say that traditionally 99% of those workers have come from Europe, and as we start to see, you know, the sudden end of free movement, which will happen in just a few short months, there's a real concern and a real question mark over whether there is sufficient provision within the immigration system. The other thing that keeps me awake at night is whether the structure of the system as it is, whether that's actually adequate. I mean, just given our attendee list today, it's quite clear to me that we're not only talking about demand during harvest season, we're not only talking about the edible horticulture sector. Surely there is a need for visas from low-skilled, mid-skilled, right up to high-skilled, all the way through the food production system and all the way through the agriculture system. And there's really very limited provision for that within the immigration system as it's currently structured. So I'll be really interested to hear your views and to take questions from you in terms of, you know, whether we can look to the domestic market, whether there are changes that we'd like to see in the immigration system that can really start to actually adequately meet the sector's workforce needs going forward. So I hope I've sort of given you a bit of a flavour and a taste of my views in terms of the challenges for the sector in the short to mid term future. I'm going to hand over to Heidi now, who will talk us through some of the challenges that the sector are experiencing right now in the current circumstances that we're all operating in. So I'll hand you over. Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and good morning, everyone. So as Emma said, I'm going to talk to you about the coronavirus job retention scheme, which a lot of you will be familiar with, as well as the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. I do appreciate in the food sector that furlough, as we perhaps more commonly know it, is not going to be as prevalent with having so many key workers. So I'm just going to cover it briefly, but of course, if you've got any questions at the end, happy to cover those. So the furlough scheme, or the job retention scheme, has been in place since March now, and perhaps becoming a bit more of our normal working life for many organisations. But the government have made some changes. So the scheme originally was going to end in June, but it's now been extended to October. And what the government have done is almost in effect closed the old scheme and almost created a new one. So from the 1st of July, the government introduced what they're calling flexible furlough, and it is exactly as what it says on the tin, that you can now have if you have any people on furlough, you can bring them back on a really flexible basis. So it could be that you could ask them to work for an hour a day or a few hours a day or 1 week and then not the next week. It is literally as flexible as you need it to be. What that means is where those employees are working for you, they are paid as normal. You just pay them as normal at 100% and all the other terms and conditions. But when you then don't need them and they're on, in effect, the furlough part of the flexible furlough, it's a difficult word to say, then they receive the 80% grant unless you're, of course, paying extra. Now, with that change has come a few other sort of timescales as well. So what the government have said is from the 30th of June, any furlough amounts that you had pre that date, anything that you would normally claim through via the HMRC portal, you have to have claimed for by the 31st of July. After that date, you won't be able to claim for any furlough rebates from the 30th of June. Now, from the 1st of July, they're also changing it slightly so that every time you make claims going forward through the portal, the furlough has to almost start and end and be claimed in the same calendar month, which is probably very similar for a lot of companies if you're working that around your payroll deadlines. But for some organisations, that will be a change, and it's just a new sort of process to get into. In terms of your employees, they won't necessarily notice a lot of difference in terms of their pay because it will remain 80% or the 100% if they're working. But there are also the reduction in grants that will start from August as well. So each month there'll be a little bit less that you can claim for as an employer, taking us all the way up to the end of October. Likewise, the agreements that we would have had in place beforehand for our employees, which said you are on furlough, they can continue as normal, but if you wanted to move them onto flexible furlough, you will need to have a new agreement in place. Not overly complicated, again, it's just having a conversation, getting them to agree, and then providing them a new agreement. And that's certainly something Duncan and Toplis can help with if you were needing that. I think that's the main thing, really. You can't furlough anyone new anymore either. So if you've never furloughed someone in the past, you can't furlough them going forward. But if you have furloughed them before for a minimum of 3 weeks, but they're back at work now, but you needed to furlough them again before October, that's absolutely fine. So I hope that's quite a quick overview, but as I say, if you've got any questions on that, I'll cover that. But to some extent, I think we're getting a bit more to grips to it. We're hoping there won't be too many more changes now. We should now be in a bit of a period of stability with that. The next change then really is the statutory sick pay. Again, this is not a new scheme as such. This came in a little while ago and the portal's been open, but just to recap on that. So this is the statutory sick pay rebate scheme specifically for coronavirus. So this isn't anything to do with normal sickness where people are off for any other reason. That just continues as normal. But for any of your employees, and this is from the 18th of March, it originally started, any of your employees that were off sick because they were perhaps isolating, so they might have had people at home that have got symptoms, or they're displaying symptoms, or it might be that they're shielding, anything, or of course if they have COVID themselves, they would be entitled to statutory sick pay with the normal statutory sick pay rules. The waiting days were removed, so whereas normally you would have to wait 3 days before that SSP kicked in effect, that was removed also for COVID-related absence. But in addition to that, employers can still claim back 2 weeks of that SSP pay. Now, there are a couple of criteria on that. Obviously, they has to be COVID-related, but also you have to have your PAYE payroll scheme in place created before the 28th of February. And also this is only for employers with 250 employees or less at the 28th of February. And that's, say, if you had lots of groups of companies, that's a combined, it has to be 250 still as a maximum. So I've talked through what you do, and you can claim that through the portal. I think absence is something that probably concerns me a little bit more. I think it is something that is a challenge anyway for employers. But we are heading towards, we're perhaps having a slightly easier period of it maybe now. I don't know. It's difficult, isn't it? Because it seems to be going down, but we are hearing all these horror stories that it may get worse and worse as the winter comes. And we're then going to be in a situation where anyone with any kind of symptoms will have to be isolated, which of course, when you put in normal colds, normal flu, etc., is going to create potentially more isolation needs. Children being back at school, they'll have to be isolated, and we don't know all the details, but it's certainly going to be a concern, I think, for employers, that you're going to have more and more of your employees being paid SSP and isolating for 7 to 14 days, depending on what they're there for, in line with track and trace or other reasons. So it is something for employers to consider how they will best manage that, but it's not going to be easy. But happy to, of course, cover any questions on that. So that's kind of the main points I was going to cover. So I hope that gives you a very quick overview, and then we can chat more when you have questions. So what I'm going to do now is hand you over to Daniel McNally. So Daniel's going to talk to us about social distancing in terms of the workplace, how all the latest changes or things that might be coming up to make sure our workplace are safe going forward. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Heidi. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Daniel McNally. I'm a regulatory lawyer here at Freeths, and I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the key challenges facing the sector from a health and safety perspective. It's worth mentioning at the start that the law in this area is well established and has been for many years, and the pandemic hasn't changed that. And essentially, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the law requires all employers to ensure the health and safety of their employees by identifying risks in the workplace and either eliminating those risks if possible, but where that's not possible, then reducing those risks as much as is reasonably practicable. So whilst there haven't been any changes in terms of legislation, what the government have done, of course, is introduce lots of guidance in this area for different workplace environments. So, for example, for those involved in food production and manufacturing, there is specific guidance that applies to factories, plants and warehouses, for instance. And whilst this guidance isn't law, it is being used by regulators as a benchmark. So when they're inspecting businesses, they'll look at the guidance and then form an opinion as to whether employers are discharging their duties under health and safety legislation. Why is that important? Well, of course, any company, any business which fails to meet the requisite standard runs the risk of enforcement action, which in the worst case scenario would involve a criminal prosecution. And yes, that is, of course, always important, but particularly so in the current climate when in recent weeks the government have made it clear that they have provided the regulatory bodies such as the Health and Safety Executive with additional funds to field complaints and carry out workplace inspections. Only very recently I was made aware of a statistic which said that in the last couple of months there's been over 4,000 workplace inspections, and out of those inspections approximately 10% required a further follow-up inspection because the businesses in question hadn't introduced sufficient safeguards, and out of those who underwent a follow-up inspection, a further 10% still hadn't introduced sufficient safeguards to protect their workforce. And of course, in those circumstances, they run the risk of further enforcement action. So there's that to bear in mind, but also there's clearly been a change of tone in what we're hearing from the government, and they are becoming much tougher in their message to businesses and the wider public. For instance, at the start of the pandemic, when you look at the workplace guidance that has been published, the government didn't make any reference to the possibility of a criminal prosecution, for instance. But now, when you look at the most recent draft, there is reference to that as a possibility where there have been serious breaches of the law. So with all that in mind, the food sector really need to keep their eye on the ball here by following 3 key steps. First and foremost, they need to follow the government guidance. That is the benchmark by which they will be judged. Secondly, they need to monitor compliance with any new working procedures. The government guidance is actually very quiet on this point, but it is a very important one. Companies need to monitor how effective their working procedures are, and they also need to look at whether their employees are following those procedures, because again, that's something which, if they are inspected, the regulators will be checking. And thirdly and finally, they need to monitor government guidance, which in many respects is a moving feast. What might be considered a reasonable safeguard today may not be considered a reasonable safeguard tomorrow. And we've seen, for instance, the most obvious example there is in relation to face coverings. The government have, throughout the course of this pandemic, played down the significance of face coverings, but yet in recent weeks we've seen legislation come into force which now requires everybody to wear them on public transport. And of course, as of today, we've seen an announcement that there'll be a further requirement for people to wear face coverings in supermarkets and in shops. So again, it's very important that those in the food sector keep an eye on government guidance as it changes. So that's a very quick overview of what I have to say from a health and safety standpoint. So I'll hand back to Alistair now and look forward to taking any questions shortly.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Emma and Heidi as well. That was absolutely great for an introduction to all your various topics. I've had a few questions start to come through. I think actually, Daniel, one to start with for you. So we've got, how does the food sector remain COVID secure during the pandemic?
First and foremost, the term COVID secure isn't one I like because it suggests that there is a way that businesses can eliminate the risk completely, when the reality is, due to the nature of this virus, that's just not possible. And when you actually read the government guidance, they acknowledge that, but the term itself is misleading. But in terms of making the workplace COVID secure, businesses need to follow the government guidance, which essentially is set around these following principles. First and foremost, employees should be encouraged to work from home where possible. I appreciate that's slightly difficult in this sector. Where that's not possible, companies need to undertake a specific COVID-19 risk assessment. And when they're doing that, they are encouraged to involve their employees as part of that process. Thirdly, they need to introduce enhanced cleaning procedures. And finally, they need to, of course, adhere to guidance around social distancing, which essentially is split into two parts. First and foremost, they need to maintain a distance of 2 metres. But where that's not possible, then they need to manage the risk of transmission as much as possible. So, for instance, when you look at the guidance, they talk about the installation of plastic screens, they talk about different working procedures, for example, working side to side or back to back rather than face to face, and so on and so forth. So when they use the term COVID secure, that's what the government mean. It's a misleading term, but essentially those are the principles which govern that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then Heidi, on some of the various schemes, got a question. What should we do if a seasonal worker has been advised to self-quarantine?
The reality is that then you need to allow that to happen. So there's a number of ways that people could be advised. So if they are displaying symptoms, then they should be letting you know and not coming into the workplace. If they have people at their home that have got symptoms, they equally should be isolating. There's also now the track and trace, so they could get a call out of the blue to say, actually, you've been in contact with someone, we believe, and therefore you also need to isolate. There is now a really clear process in that they can ring 119. They will advise them as well and ensure that they do isolate and give them that advice. So you are going to have to allow them to do that. It's really important that they're not allowed into the workplace. It is difficult now because perhaps in the past when people were off sick, so to speak, then we would get GP fit notes, and they're not as available now, but actually there are now isolation notes and they can be provided from 119 online or through them speaking to them. So they're fairly easy to get hold of, and you can ask them to show them to you. But ultimately that is going to be classed as sickness. They will get SSP or enhanced if you have an enhanced sickness policy. But at the minimum they'll get the SSP, and the waiting days I mentioned earlier won't be relevant. But of course you can claim back some of that money from the government providing you meet that criteria. So it is a real challenge though, because this is going to, well, it's already happening now, but it may well happen more and more and more, and that's going to be really difficult for employers to deal with if they've got a lot of people isolating. It's important, I would advise, to have a really clear policy on it. So whilst it's government guidance, you can't go against that. I would recommend that you have a really clear policy of how your employees manage that, so they're comfortable with that process, because it is confusing, it's a lot for people to learn, and it helps to give them that information at the output.
Thank you. And actually, a bit of a follow-up to that one is, can our attendees backdate a claim for SSP?
Yes, they can. So if you haven't claimed for your SSP COVID related and you do meet the criteria, 250 employees or less, and your PAYE from the 28th of February, you can backdate it up to the 18th of March. So yeah, that's not a problem. You can just go online, and there's not actually that much detail they need. They don't need to see, for example, isolation notes. So it's worth doing that, certainly.
Okay. I have a question on the seasonal agricultural workers scheme. So this is one for you, Emma. If the government is not planning to provide a lower skilled route beyond the seasonal agricultural workers scheme, how does it expect the food and agriculture sector to meet its workforce needs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. If we were asking that question to DEFRA and to the Home Office, the answer that we would be given is, well, you can rely on our domestic workforce, and we expect you to innovate. So we expect you to look to agri-tech to essentially restructure your workforce. But I mean, interestingly, the whole COVID crisis gave the government an opportunity to test the willingness and ability of the domestic workforce to provide for the agriculture sector. And while there was a certain amount of willingness while people were on furlough, the reality was, for all sorts of different reasons, that the domestic workforce just wasn't able to, wasn't willing to. There was geographical limitations, difficulties with fitting a sort of pick for Britain role around their existing lives, and for all of a multitude of reasons, it just, even in a time of emergency, it just wasn't possible to source the workforce that was needed from our domestic workforce. And in terms of agri-tech, you know, I've no doubt when I speak to businesses in these sectors, I have absolutely no doubt that agri-tech is an important part of their planning for the future. But that future isn't a future that's going to be ready in 6 months' time, which is when free movement will end. So I don't think that agri-tech provides a solution in the short time that we have available. So, you know, if I was having that conversation with the Home Office and DEFRA in front of me, you know, I would be saying, well, there isn't a good alternative solution in place at the moment. And, you know, whether you want to see it as a short to medium term plan, we need to look at an adequate replacement for free movement, and we need that in place on the 1st of January 2021.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. And actually, a second question here, which it might be a short answer, but is it too late to hope for a reversal of policy and for provision to be made for a lower skilled or temporary visa route?
Yeah, it's never too late. Policies can always change. But, you know, this new immigration system, it was one of the widest consultation periods that I've ever consultation exercises that I've ever seen the Home Office undertake. They consulted broadly across sectors, across geographical regions, to local authorities, charities, in order, they said, to be able to shape a new immigration system that was fit for purpose, that would work. And all the consultation exercises I attended, businesses in all different sectors said we need a low skilled route. And there were originally plans for a lower skilled route. There's plans for a temporary worker visa, and then they hit the edit room floor and didn't make it into the final plans. Now, I said at the time, you know, what we need in some ways, even though it's a bit grim, what we need is a crisis to show how important these lower to mid-skill level roles are. Unfortunately, we've had a crisis, and that has revealed how important lower skilled roles are, for instance, in the care sector. But despite that, we had announcements yesterday which still didn't provide for lower skilled roles within the care sector. And then we can extrapolate that across all of the sectors, including food and agriculture, that desperately need these roles to be filled. So what I would say is, no, it's not too late. We could have a change of government, we could have a change of heart, and we need to really, I think all these sectors where it's absolutely vitally important need to speak with one voice and speak loudly, and continue to lobby government and continue to push for a change of policy.
Definitely, quite agree. Thank you, Emma. A couple of very topical questions. I think the first one aimed more at Daniel. So, based on the news of what happened in Herefordshire on the farm in, I think it was yesterday's headlines, so they had a lockdown on the actual farm itself. What additional health and safety measures do you think would be required in this instance?
It's difficult to answer that without knowing what they had in place to begin with. I mean, inevitably, given what's happened there, they will be looked at very closely, and to see whether what they had in place was sufficient. And they'll be looking at, the regulator will be looking at whether they were complying with government guidance. So it's difficult to say what else would need to be in place there. I mean, as I mentioned before, the government accept that there is no way that any business can eliminate the risk of transmission. It's just not possible given the nature of this virus. It's all about reducing the risk of transmission as much as one can. So, and that's where obviously the government guidance comes into play. But it's difficult to say what else they would need to do without knowing what they had in place in the first instance.
Okay. And actually, on the same topic, a more practical point over to Heidi, almost a live case study then. How would the employer handle that sickness situation from a HR perspective with, I think it's 200 of your seasonal workers having to stay in their accommodation?
Yeah, I mean, as Daniel said, it's there's obviously so many implications there about the health and safety and what they were doing and how different and how they might be able to, like you say, you can't completely eliminate these things at all. But from a HR point of view, ultimately, those people will, it's difficult because they're working and living together. That obviously is an extra complexity, but not an unusual situation. So they will have to be off sick. There's no sort of way around that. They will need to get the SSP, providing they're entitled in the normal rules of the scheme. And they are going to have to quarantine, which is challenging when they're living together, but I assume they'll obviously get a lot of support as how it's best to manage it from there. From a HR point of view, it would be to try and get them lots of support. The key thing is to get them all tested quickly, which I'm fairly confident will happen, so they'll all be able to get access to fairly quick tests. But it's difficult then, as even when you've had a negative test, it's knowing, because it's all of them together, who had symptoms, who didn't. I think there's a lot to work through there. It's a lot more complex than when you've got a huge amount of people together. But certainly the main thing I would be doing is to give them the support, getting to find out when the testing's happening, working out who worked with who, and see if there are any bubbles or if they are all close together, which I assume will be the case. But it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. I do think having a policy on it and being aware of what you would do, because unfortunately these situations are not going to be, it's going to happen. If you're going to have a lot of people working together, particularly if they're living together as well, you are going to risk this. And of course, symptoms, you could end up having everyone having a completely different illness than COVID, but you're not going to know that straight away until those tests are done. So it's going to be really disruptive. So thinking about how you're going to plan for that, what you would do in terms of if you had to stop working for those 2 weeks, what that would mean, how you can you get access to other resource. Yeah, I do. It's a massive sympathy for it, and it's not. There's no easy answer, I don't think, other than we've got to start talking about it and planning for it.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think planning for what might happen in the next few months is going to be key to all businesses, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one back to you then, Daniel. Given regulation is moving very quickly, and the announcements tend to happen late at night for some random reason at this moment in time, but should the food sector expect any changes to government advice on how to remain COVID secure or COVID safe, however we want to phrase it?
I think the short answer is yes. I think as we are learning more about the science and about the virus, we've seen already the government guidance change from when it was first issued back in mid-May. It's changed on a number of occasions, and the obvious example to mention is the guidance in relation to face coverings. As I mentioned earlier, the government have consistently played down the significance of face coverings in the workplace. I think the guidance currently says that they may be marginally beneficial, is the wording that they use. So you look at that on the one hand, but then how does that tally with the legislation in relation to public transport and use of shops now, where it's going to be mandatory? So it's a confusing message that the government are sending out there on that particular point, but I think it's a good example of how the guidance can change and probably will continue to change going forward.
Okay. A question, I think it's probably Dr. Heidi to start from a practical point of view, but actually, Daniel, you might have a comment from a risk assessment and point of view. So how do I handle a quarantine period if an employee travels abroad? And I suppose for you, Daniel, is what should we be doing from a risk assessment point of view if someone needs to travel abroad?
If someone has returning from abroad to the UK?
If they've had to travel abroad, I suppose it could be either they've been abroad and returning, or if they need to go abroad for work purposes in the coming months.
Well, that's something they'll need to factor into their risk assessment. And of course, one thing they may wish to consider is of course testing that employee before they return to the workplace. And I think the main point here on risk assessment is speaking with the workforce and having those open conversations with them. And I think by doing that, particularly in the food sector where there have been issues around labour and there've been problems there, I think having those open and honest conversations with them, will help satisfy the regulator by carrying out a thorough risk assessment, but B, also reassuring the employees as well.
I mean, I would just add as well, as you say, it would make sense, particularly where they're travelling from work. But of course, we will have now people going on holiday abroad. I mean, it seems like more people don't want to do it, but we certainly know that people are going away already and will continue to do it. So it has been confusing because there's been so much debate, but we do now know those travel corridors. It's a sort of maybe a changing list, but we do have our list of countries, which is quite extensive. So from that point of view, there's no, if they are travelling to one of those countries, then and it's a travel corridor, then there's no quarantine period coming back. But if there was a quarantine period, because there isn't a travel corridor, then actually they're not entitled to SSP for that quarantine period. They would have to take more leave or they would be unpaid. But again, it's worth you having a policy or some guidance on this for the employees so they're aware. And as Daniel said, if you then wanted to also from a risk assessment add additional things, and particularly if it's work related, then that also has to be covered in there as well. So it's just being clear, because we are starting to get a few questions about, I'm going to Spain for a few weeks, what does it mean and how can I do it? And I think it's trying to make people aware of those latest changes.
Thank you. And one for you, Emma. If we already have an existing and loyal European workforce, is there anything we can do now in order to retain them for next season?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. For employers who have a long-term European workforce, you will, I'm sure, have already come across the EU settlement scheme. And I know that loads and loads of employers have been very proactive in terms of ensuring that their European workers are registered on that scheme. But given that we now know that there's inadequate provision within the immigration system for new workers coming in the future, this may be a time to start thinking about whether to encourage your temporary workers to actually make use of the European settlement scheme. So the way that that would work in terms of structure is if you had a temporary worker or a cohort of temporary workers, and I know that many temporary workers come back to the same employer season after season after season, so they may be somebody well known to you and they may be somebody that you'd like to be able to bring back in the future, but you're worried about immigration provision. If they are here now and here before December the 31st, it would be possible for them to apply on the existing settlement scheme, secure what's called limited leave to remain, so pre-settled status for 5 years, but they're here as temporary workers, which usually means that they have a life back in home country and they may wish to go back to that life, certainly for part of the year, because that is how they're structuring their working arrangements. They could leave the UK for up to 6 months at a time without losing their limited leave to remain and without damaging their potential indefinite leave to remain in the future. So if we just think about that, they could be here for just over 6 months, a day over 6 months, leave for a day under 6 months, and do that every year for 5 years, and they would still then be able to secure indefinite leave to remain. Once they had that, they could come and go as much as they wish. They could carry on working for you for as much or as little as they wished, and they would only lose their indefinite leave if they were absent for 5 years. So it would give them complete flexibility. So for a 5-year period, they'd need to be a little bit cautious about their absences and make sure that they understood the provision and managed it well. But in the longer term, it's going to give them a great option, which means they don't need to be concerned about the existing immigration system, or more importantly, about what's around the corner and the future immigration system. They just know, and you'd know, that they'd have status which would enable them to really easily come and work and live here for, as I say, 6 months in every year.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So we have a couple of the questions left unanswered. So if anyone's got any further questions, please get them in now and we'll try and answer them. And I think the last two are actually kind of both aimed at you, Daniel, to be honest. So we're aware there's lots of events in the food and drink sector that have been cancelled because of COVID. Are we aware of any information relating to the event world, when people will be able to start working again, as the social distancing issues make it impossible at the minute?
I'm not. No, I'm not aware of any. No. No, I'm sorry. I can't help any further with that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I'm certainly not aware either of any moves in that sector. I think it's probably going to be into the autumn at least, isn't it? In reality, and see what happens. Okay, and then the final question we have for the time being. Are there any other regulatory issues which the food sector needs to address during the pandemic in order to remain compliant with the law?
Yes, is the short answer. As most businesses have changed the way in which they operate to control the risk of transmission, they need to bear in mind that they obviously have other legal obligations to comply with food safety legislation. Now, there's lots of guidance online from the Food Standards Agency, depending on the nature of your business. But for example, companies need to review their food safety management procedures. If they are changing the way in which they operate, does this enable them to meet their obligations under food safety law? Do they need to update the food safety manual? Do they need to update any other documentation which regulators such as local authorities are likely to check if they are subject to an inspection?
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And in the absence of any further questions, can I take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us this morning, and a special thanks to Emma, Daniel and Heidi for all their thoughts and insights this morning. If there's any questions outstanding or any questions come in the next few moments, we will get back to you over the next few days, and there'll also be a copy of this webinar available for you all. So please stay well and keep safe, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.